All right, so picture this. The Caribbean in the 1930s. You've got glamorous hotels, you know, maybe Hemingway sipping daiquiris. But while tourists are working on their tans, British naval intelligence is sweating a different kind of heat.
Yeah.
We're diving into British Naval Intelligence in the Caribbean by Paul Elms Bacardi.
It's a fascinating book, really. It shows just how closely the British were watching the region, even back then.
Yeah.
Most people don't realize, what was going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, it's not exactly like London or Berlin on the eve of war. What made the Caribbean such a hot spot for them?
Well, in a word, Panama. The Panama Canal. This wasn't just a shortcut. It was strategically vital for global shipping, especially for a naval power like Britain.
Okay, so like today's oil choke points, but for battleships and trade routes back then.
Exactly. Control that canal, you control the movement of your navy, to the Atlantic and the Pacific. And with everything going on in Europe, the British couldn't risk anyone else controlling it. They had to safeguard those trade routes.
It's like every freighter, every passenger liner. Suddenly, it's crucial.
Absolutely.
Puts a whole new spin on cruising the Caribbean, doesn't it?
Right.
But speaking of pressure, the book also talks about unrest, within the British colonies themselves. Not exactly paradise for everyone, I guess.
Definitely not. While the empire's worried about global threats, you've got anti-colonial sentiment, labor movements, all gaining momentum.
So they've got trouble brewing right under their noses. How did British intelligence handle that? Were they cracking down, or was it more, I don't know, nuanced?
It was a balancing act, for sure. They had to maintain order, but without, alienating the entire population.
Yeah.
The book talks about how they used a network of agents.
Spies on the ground?
Basically, yeah. They'd infiltrate these movements, gather information on key figures, that sort of thing. Trying to figure out, are these genuine grievances, or is this going to be a full-blown uprising? All while navigating the complexities of Caribbean society.
Talk about a pressure cooker. Did it work? I mean, did these tactics actually work in the long run?
That's the big question, isn't it? Did they contain the unrest, or did they just make things worse? It's a debate historians still have. And it's something we see even today. Governments trying to find that balance, security versus individual rights.
So we've got the British Empire, right, trying to hold everything together, facing unrest at home, pressure abroad. And then things get even more interesting when this book brings in the Axis powers. Germany, specifically.
Yeah, it's easy to forget about that while all this is happening.
Yeah.
The Nazis are gaining power in Europe, and their ambitions, well, they weren't exactly limited to Europe.
The Caribbean was on their radar.
Oh, absolutely. It was strategically important, just like we've been talking about.
So what were they up to in Paradise? Just spying on the British, or was there more to it?
Well, according to Bacardi, there were several goals. Intelligence gathering was definitely a big one, of course. They wanted to know about British and American naval movements, but they were also interested in, disrupting things. Allied shipping, potentially even setting up secret bases.
Secret bases. Now, this is sounding like a Bond film.
Right. And the book actually, it gets into some specifics. One tactic was using German businesses operating in the Caribbean as fronts.
Klar.
Right. For example, Bacardi mentions this German-owned shipping company. On the surface, they're transporting cargo, but they were suspected of smuggling, agents and supplies, all for those espionage operations.
It's amazing how this book just peels back those layers, like you've got this whole other network operating beneath the surface of everyday life. Makes you wonder what else is hidden in history, But going back to the British, how did they respond to this, to this German presence?
They had to be careful. Accusing another government of espionage, that could cause a huge incident, especially without solid proof. So they relied on, more covert operations.
Their own secret agents.
Exactly. Bacardi talks about increased surveillance, intercepting communications, that kind of thing. They even planted their own agents within those suspected German networks.
So high stakes.
Right.
Did it work? Did they uncover anything big? German agents, plots, any of that?
That's the thing about intelligence. It's all very hush-hush, even now. The book doesn't give us, a list of successful missions. Yeah. But it does make it clear that these efforts, they helped the British get a much clearer picture of what the Germans were doing.
So they knew more, even if they couldn't prove everything.
Exactly. They could identify potential threats, disrupt some operations, even anticipate some German moves.
A constant chess match.
Absolutely.
All this talk about naval bases and espionage, it makes me think about the British Navy's presence there. In the Caribbean, it wasn't just about intelligence gathering, was it? They needed a way to back it all up, right?
Of course. They had those strategically important bases like Bermuda, Jamaica. served as both deterrents and, forward operating bases if needed.
Right, makes sense.
And the Caribbean, it wasn't just about projecting power either. It was a perfect training ground for the Royal Navy.
Training ground, really?
Yeah.
I mean, I know the Caribbean's beautiful, but I wouldn't think of it as, some kind of intense military training area.
It was. Think about it. The warm waters, the different conditions. It provided unique challenges for the Navy, adapting to different weather, navigational hazards, even the heat and humidity. Bacardi mentions how these exercises were crucial for them. They could identify weaknesses, refine tactics, make sure they were as ready as possible.
Interesting. It's easy to think about the Caribbean in one way, but for those sailors, it was a whole different experience. Speaking of alliances and preparations, the book mentions some early cooperation between the British and U.S. intelligence in the Caribbean. What can you tell us about that?
That's where things get really interesting. Relations between those two in the 1930s were, well, they were complicated. A long history of rivalry, mistrust, all that. But as Bacardi shows, the threat of fascism, especially from Germany, it kind of forced them to rethink things.
So a common enemy brings them closer, even if they weren't exactly friends.
Yeah, you could say that. They weren't exactly sharing a beach umbrella just yet, but they knew they had to work together, at least a little.
So what did that look like, in the context of the Caribbean? Were they actually sharing secret information, or was it more of that keep your friends close but your enemies closer kind of thing?
It happened gradually. Started with just sharing intelligence on Axis ships in the area. Bacardi even mentions them coordinating some naval patrols, exchanging info on possible espionage. So trust was building, but slowly, like those first steps toward a real partnership.
A Caribbean alliance forged in the shadow of war.
Wow. It really drives home how these events, even though they're happening on these, tropical islands, they have huge implications. It reminds you that history isn't just made in those big cities and palaces, right?
Exactly. And speaking of those far-off places, I know you've been waiting for those juicy examples of espionage and those covert operations Bacardi talks about.
I have, yes. Give me the inside scoop on the cloak and dagger stuff going on.
Okay, well, one that really stood out to me involved these suspected sabotage attempts on British merchant ships right there in Caribbean ports.
Oh. And it wasn't like those big explosions you see in movies, It was more subtle, messing with engines, the fuel supply, even just spreading rumors among the crew, disrupting things.
Oh, sneaky. Did they ever catch who was doing it?
That's the thing about this kind of work. Proof is hard to come by. Bacardi suggests that, yeah, the British believed it was German agents, and they took steps to, counteract it, tighten security, watch certain individuals closely, and they even put their own agents, like we were talking about before, into those suspected German networks.
Sounds incredibly dangerous. The people involved in those operations must have been incredibly brave.
Absolutely. They were putting their lives at risk, often working alone, and often they didn't get any recognition for it. It's a side of history we don't hear much about, but it's important to remember them.
It really is. Well, as we wrap up our deep dive here into British naval intelligence in the 1930s Caribbean, what's the biggest takeaway you hope our listeners will, think about after this?
I think it's that realization that even places that seem idyllic, far away, they can be caught up in these major historical events. The Caribbean, we think relaxation, escape, but it played a crucial role in the power struggles of that time. And it all led up to World War II.
It shows that geography really doesn't matter when it comes to history, and that sometimes those unexpected places hold the most, surprising stories.
Very well said. I'll let you take it from here.
A huge thank you to our expert for, shining a light on this fascinating period. And to our listeners, if you want to dive even deeper into this world of, espionage and all this intrigue, be sure to check out British Naval Intelligence in the Caribbean by Paul Elms Bacardi. We'll have links on our website to that, plus some extra stuff, maps, timelines, even some old intelligence documents that have been declassified. Until next time, keep exploring.